Well, good Shabbos and Chodesh Tov, for it's a new month. In one of the opening verses of our Torah portion this week, we encounter what I had always previously considered kind of a weird command. There's a number of them, actually, but it says, V'im amor ya'amor ha'eved, and if the servant shall plainly say, Ahavti et adoni, I love my master, Ve'et ishti ve'et bani, and my wife and my son, lo etzeh chofshi, I will not go free. Then his master shall bring him before God, and shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall bore through his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. What? This idea has always seemed strange to me. Why doesn't he want to go free? Who would choose to continue in servitude? Is it simply because he doesn't want to leave his wife and children? And what's the thing with the ear, right? It's a funky earring, right? But this raises even additional challenges. What's all this discussion about slavery? It's important to acknowledge that there are things in the biblical text that will make us uncomfortable. If you have never been challenged with this, then you're not reading the Bible correctly, right? You're not reading your Bible at all if they're not things that occasionally make you uncomfortable. However, whenever we encounter things that challenge our faith, the answer is never to just give up and walk away and conclude that the Bible is flawed. Instead, we must wrestle with it and try to figure out what is really going on. And I admit, sometimes there is stuff that makes me uncomfortable, but we also have to wrestle with it. We have to be careful about putting our own modern sensitivities, this is another thing we need to be careful about, is putting our own modern sensitivities, assumptions, and worldview onto the biblical text. We need to figure out what is the biblical text trying to say in its context, which in this case is thousands of years old. Although we, of course, believe the Bible is applicable today and across time, it is important to wrestle with these important tensions. That is how I would challenge us this morning as we wrestle with this idea of slavery in the Bible. This week's Parashat, Mishpatim, is actually a continuation of last week's Torah portion, where God begins giving the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. It's really important to remember that chapters were never originally in the text, right? And even the Torah portions are something that came into practice in probably the early Middle Ages. So when we divide up stories, we have to remember that the story might not necessarily have meant to be divided up. And this is kind of, we have to consider, even with Mishpatim, it's really a continuation of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Last week was that mountain shaking with fire and the giving of the 10 utterances and the beginning of a discussion of the construction of the altar. We then continue right into this week's parasha, which deals primarily with civil and tort law. And the first matters of civil law we encounter are laws based on what's called indentured servitude or debt bondage. According to biblical scholar Nahum Sarna, within the Torah, there is no attempt to separate ethical and ritual concerns. They're combined, right? In our modern world, we want to separate, this is the godly stuff and this is the other stuff. But the Bible doesn't do that. Everything has the potential for holiness, right? The point is graphically illustrated by the first group of laws in this week's Torah portion, that of Jewish bondservants. Because even the most degraded members of society were still created in the image of God, and their treatment was to be carefully regulated by the Torah. I don't want you to miss this point. By dealing with perceptions of what is property, the Torah is raising an issue that is a matter of holiness. It is not just how we treat those who are peers and colleagues. This is what even Yeshua says, right? It's easy to treat those who are good to you good, right? But he says, but I say pray for those who persecute you. Love those who hate you, right? It is but we need to consider what the Torah is doing here. It's even how we treat others who are considered lower than us in status. Not just how we treat one another, especially if they're friends and colleagues, but how we treat those who are lower than us. Or perceived, really it's perceived as lower than us. And the reality that even those who we look down upon have rights, privileges, and obligations according to the Torah. Okay, let's back up and unpack the beginning of our Torah portion, which began, Ve'ele ha-mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. And these are the ordinances which you shall set before them. I wanted to unpack that, but my wife said no rabbit trails this morning. So, because this is actually kind of a long sermon, but bear with me. If you buy a Hebrew servant, it says, Ki tikne eved ivri. This is talking about Jews. This isn't talking about non-Jews. If you purchase a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th year he shall be free for no charge. If he came by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he was married, then his wife leave with him. But if his master gave him a wife, and she bore him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall leave by himself. But if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him before God, and shall bring him to the door, or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore through his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. The text goes on to describe young girls who are sold into servanthood and their roles, rights, and obligations. Agreed, this talk of buying and selling people should make us uncomfortable. It should. But let's break this down further. There are two types of servanthood, or really debt bondage. Well, no, in this case we're talking about slavery, or servanthood in the Bible. Number one, the first type of slavery in the Bible, which is not common. It's not common. And that is when non-Jews are either purchased or captured in war, they don't have the same kind of rights that Jews do. I'm not going to try to, give apologetics for that. It wasn't right, but we're talking about something that was 2,000 years ago or more. It's with 3,300 years ago. It's approximately when we believe the Torah was written. 3,300 plus or minus a few years. It's about plus a few. But 3,300 years. But the second, and this is the second type of servitude in the Torah, which is by far the most common, which is debt bondage. When a fellow Israelite becomes what's called a bondservant. What happens, and this is still practiced in some societies today, and it was very common until recently, if you got yourself out in a tremendous amount of debt, you had to work that off. There was no, there is a type of bankruptcy, but it's not like today, right? If you get yourself into debt, you either somehow find a way to walk away from it or whatever, but then your debtor could take you captive and make you work off what you owed them. Now, let's get into this. Apparently, this is a common problem. And there were two ways that a Jew could become a bondsperson in debt bondage. Number one, according to Leviticus 25:39, he can sell himself as an escape from extreme poverty. So one way, according to Leviticus, that a person who is Jewish, who is an Israelite, could become in debt bondage is if they're so severely poor that they have no other means other than selling their services to someone else. Second, according to Exodus 22:2, he may be a thief who is sold by the court to raise funds to repay his victims. This is also the way somebody becomes in debt bondage, was if they're a thief. Additionally, we often make the mistake of comparing servitude in the Bible to our own modern and pre-modern understandings of slavery, especially, for example, the antebellum South. Although there was that kind of slavery in ancient times, and still is, sadly, that is not what we're dealing with in the Torah, right? So when we're talking about slavery in the Torah, although that sort of exists, the most common type is debt bondage. It's a different kind of a thing. The difference is great. In the antebellum South, for example, slavery was unregulated. The law primarily protected the slave owner and did not deal with how slaves were to be treated or offer them rights. Everybody with me so far? For example, in South Carolina, when it came to matters of damages, the law considered a slave to be 3/5 of a person. We did not even consider them full human beings. And although there may have been some social protocols against beating or mistreating slaves, there were no repercussions usually. A slave owner could beat his slave to death if he so chose and never face any criminal consequences. It wasn't conceived of as murder. This is a problem. Slaves were simply property, and one could do with their property as they saw fit. And the only way for a slave to ever experience freedom in the antebellum South was to either be set free out of goodwill, which was completely unlikely, be bought by someone else and then set free, which also was rare, or to somehow earn enough money to buy their own freedom, which also rarely happened. So basically, someone born a slave would die a slave. And because slaves were treated as perpetual property, even when the slave owner died, the slaves could be willed to somebody else. It was terrible. However, keep in mind that the Bible particularly deals with debt bondage. Fellow Israelites who sold themselves or were sold by the court to pay off a debt. And the Bible describes in great detail the protections of these bondservants, their rights, and how they are to be treated. So unlike our modern examples of slavery, these Jewish bondservants could only serve for a maximum of how many years? 6 years. And in the 7th year, they're to be set free. And when they were set free, the Torah commands that the owner must send them away with some property so that they don't leave empty-handed. There's an expectation that, yes, they worked off their debt, but you need to leave them with dignity so that they can rebuild their lives and not be stuck back in the same perpetual loop. Now, it's up to the person to want to do that, right? But the idea is the Torah sets up the dignity of the individual. Although it is still not ideal, it is a very different situation than the antebellum South. Do you see where I'm going with this? Not only did Israelite bondservants go free in the 7th year, they also had rights. If, for example, an owner mistreated a bondservant, there could be consequences. They were members of your home, rested on Shabbat and the Chagim, and were fed well and treated like a member of your household. And if these protections were violated, the servant would not only be set free, but often even awarded damages for their emotional and physical distress. If you were in debt bondage, you could take your master to a Beit Din, to a court, if you were being mistreated. Now, obviously, there you have to decide, is this an exaggeration or, but the point is you had rights, which is very different than, for example, the antebellum South. If an owner beat his slave and he died, the penalty could also be death for the owner, because it was a life for a life. Think about that for a second. The Torah considers bondservants to be human beings, a life for a life. Laws in the antebellum South did not consider a slave to be equal to a life, right? It's 3/5 of a person, and so therefore it's not a life for a life. This is something our own government and culture until recent times did not do. Remember, even if it was enforced, for example, in South Carolina, a slave was only 3/5 of a person, meaning that they were not a person. It was not a life for a life. And the Israelite bondservants, they could be redeemed, meaning they were a fellow person, right? You could be redeemed. Only people can be redeemed. Property cannot. According to the commentator Or HaChaim, the opening words of this passage imply that if a Jew has the choice of buying a Jewish bondservant or a Gentile slave, they should purchase their fellow Jew, even if it would be more economical to buy or hire a Gentile. Because the idea is that a fellow Jew is in such financial distress that they must sell their services, therefore their brethren are morally obligated to help them out. So if you were in a situation and you could buy a Gentile slave, but you also have this situation where there is a fellow Jewish person who is in such, either by decision of the court or by their own means, you need to help out the Jewish person first. The Torah brings this back to a moral and ethical matter. And how we treat these individuals while they are within our household is also a matter of importance. Were there examples of abuses? I'm sure there were, of course. And in fact, our Haftarah this week from Jeremiah actually deals, if it was a normal, not Rosh Chodesh, then the Torah reading, the Haftarah reading would have been from Jeremiah, and it deals exactly with this, the punishment of God enacted against Israel because of their mistreatment of fellow Jews who were in servitude. So abuses did happen, but the Torah doesn't set up for abuses to happen. And in Jeremiah, God comes to their rescue, which all leads us back to where we began, to the guy who does not wish to be set free and what is to be done. Remember? But if the servant shall plainly say, Ahavti et adoni et ishti vet bini, like I love my master, my wife, and my children, therefore I will not go free, then his master shall bring him before God, and shall bring him to the door unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore through his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. We often read this as a heroic act. He so loved his master, and he was so loved his wife and his child that he gave up his own freedom rather than be set free. We usually read this as a sacrificial act. We read often Yeshua's words into this, right? But that is not how this verse was read in ancient times. In ancient times, this is not a good thing. Remember, you could buy your wife and child back. You know what I mean? Like, you didn't have to stay in servitude. The Torah actually disdains the bondsman who spurns his freedom and chooses to debase himself by remaining in bondage. And the ceremony that extends his servitude emphasizes his ear and a door. What is this bizarre ritual? The sages of the Talmud explain, God says that the children of Israel are to be my servants, but this bondservant is so degraded he would rather choose to be a servant of a servant. Furthermore, this passage refers to a thief who was sold into servitude to repay his victims. And lastly, the doorway symbolizes freedom. For it was on their doorposts in Egypt that the Jewish people applied the bloods of the Pesach offering just before they were freed, with the additional result being that the death passed over the Jewish homes, right? The blood on the doorpost is supposed to bring freedom, and in this case, blood on the doorpost means you're in bondage. Therefore, the sages explained that the ear, which heard at Mount Sinai the commandment not to steal, stole and was sold into servitude, and this servant now spurns the desire to go free after 6 years. So the ear is bored with an awl. Why? Because a Jew who prefers to be a servant of a human master rather than owe his allegiance entirely to the master of the universe has rejected the lesson of the doorpost in Egypt. The doorpost which led to freedom and the ear that heard the commandments now becomes the device of enslavement. Therefore, the boring of the ear is done against the door. And it turns out this is a ritual to punish those who prefer bondage over freedom. Isn't that fascinating? That the idea was this is not a good thing. The point here is that the Torah has a bias toward freedom. Instead, we should constantly pursue freedom for ourselves and for others, right? This is the message, that we should be always those who pursue freedom for ourselves and others. Freeing ourselves and others from bondage is a holy act. That is why our Torah portion goes on to speak of other matters of justice, because we're supposed to be actively involved in the world around us and seeking the betterment of others. And this emphasis on freedom and the pursuit of freedom for others is also reinforced by Yeshua. In Matthew chapter 20, Yeshua states, beginning in verse 25, but Yeshua called out to them and said, you know that among the goyim, among the nations, those who are supposed to rule them become tyrants, right? He's saying you're not supposed to be like this. If you have people who are indebted to you, you're not supposed to be a tyrant toward them. And their superiors become dictators. Among you, it must not be done like that. On the contrary, whoever among you wants to be a leader must become your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be last. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And in John chapter 8, it relates this story. So Yeshua said to the Judeans who had trusted him, if you obey what I say, then you are really my Talmidim. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you, it doesn't say in bondage, it says set you free. And they answered, we are the seed of Abraham, and have never been slaves to anyone, which is not true. Right? So what do you mean by saying you will be set free? And Yeshua answered them, yes, indeed, I tell you that everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Now, a slave does not remain with a family forever. This is alluding back to our Torah portion this week, right? You're not supposed to be a slave forever. For 6 years, then the 7th year, go free. But a son does remain with it forever. So if the Son frees you, you were free indeed, right? You will really be free. I know you are the seed of Abraham, yet you are out to kill me because what I am saying makes no headway with you. So just to wrap up, number one, that when we encounter texts in the Torah that seem difficult, we need to wrestle with it and unpack it. Sometimes we're still uncomfortable with it, and we have to realize that, yes, times have changed, and we change with it. But even the values of things like freedom are built into the text itself. Even this idea of a Jewish bondservant was never meant to be entirely enslaved forever, and how they were supposed to be treated was a matter of holiness. Second, we're supposed to be pursuers of freedom for ourselves and others, because it's a matter of justice, and justice is a matter of holiness. This is why, within both the Jewish community and even among many clergy, those who fought for freedom for others, because they saw in the text that God desired something greater than us being in bondage to one another, even if it's debt related. And that spiritually, all of us, we cannot treat others or look down on others terribly, because the reality is Yeshua says we are all slaves because we're all enslaved to sin. And yet by trusting in him, we have been set free. And therefore we should seek the freedom of others, right? So Avinu, our Father, I pray that you would help us wrestle not only with the difficult texts, but learn the values that we can get out of it. To be able to see that even the Torah ultimately looks to freedom, looks to redemption, looks to set people free, to give them hope and a means and dignity. And therefore, we are called to do the same. As followers of our Messiah, we are supposed to set others free. For those who have been set free are free indeed. So I pray that you would do that work within us and cause us to constantly be about the work of the kingdom. And we pray this in the name of Yeshua. Amen.